Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg. And in the video today, I'm going to be addressing the question, can you take communion while you're fasting? And specifically, we're going to be talking about if you're fasting food and or drink, because of course you can fast other things. And so essentially, the concern behind this that some might have in the situation is, if they're fasting food and drink, um, they might have this feeling of, well, eating and drinking is a part of taking communion. So is it breaking the fast to take it? If you're in a situation where, let's say, you're fasting, eating for a few days, and during that time you visit a church where they're serving communion, some people might have this feeling of, oh, well, can I take communion? It does involve eating. Does that break the fast? Do I basically got to start the fast all over if I take this? Do I have to, awkwardly decline the communion when they try to serve it to me? If so, how do I explain that? And so I just kind of want to talk about how do you navigate that. So the short answer first is you can take communion while you're fasting, food and drink. And the reason for it is the nature of what communion is, that it transcends mere eating and drinking. And also, the mindset of taking communion actually goes along very well with the mindset we should have about fasting. And so, I want to read a passage and verse about this that both have to do with communion and the Last Supper specifically. So, Matthew chapter 26, verses 26 through 29. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So already we can see Jesus describes the wine and bread in communion as elements that transcend just simple food. He said that they represent his blood and his body. That's how we should think of them. But a verse in the book of Luke speaks to this even more of how we should think about it. And this also is the Last Supper, Luke's account. So, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, and he took bread and gave thanks and brake it and gave unto them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. So, not only do the elements of communion transcend mere, eating and drinking, but we're supposed to do it in remembrance of Christ. When we take that, it's not primarily intended, to satisfy, our palate or to nourish our physical hunger. We're supposed to do it to remember what Christ did for us. And so the intention of taking communion is going to be different than your intention of sitting down and eating dinner or, something like that. Um, so that's a big reason for this. That's the first big reason of why it would be okay to take communion while you're fasting food or drink, is that we're not supposed to think of these elements as mere food or drink anyway, and it doesn't have the same intention. Um, and a way to illustrate that too is, like I said, the intention isn't the same of taking communion as sitting down and eating dinner. And another way to look at it too is, if you're ever hungry, just in your day to day life, do you ever think, man, I'm so hungry, I should go take communion? No, we don't do that, because that's not how we think of it. We think of it as this separate thing from mere eating and drinking. So that's the first big reason. And then the second part of this is that the mentality we're supposed to have about taking communion lines up very well with the mentality we're supposed to have about fasting. And I've touched on that a little bit with this verse from Luke. But when we're fasting, um, we're giving up something, and we are supposed to be in a time of prayer. When you're fasting, you're supposed to be, reaching out to God in prayer and kind of having that godly mindset. We should have a godly mindset in our day to day life anyway, but, that should be a time of, seeking God even more and thinking about how God sustains us and not that thing that we're giving up. So, when we fast food, really, when you think about it, that's kind of a way of showing, ultimately, while food does offer nourishment and there is a place for it, for our physical health, ultimately, God sustains us above anything else, even that food. And when we look at what Jesus said about taking communion, he said, "This do in remembrance of me." And so that goes along with that fasting mindset very well. Because, if you're fasting food or drink and you take communion while you're fasting, it's not like you have to put your fasting mindset on the shelf to take communion and then pick it back up when you're done. Through the whole time, you should be focusing on Christ and what he's done for you. So when you take communion, whether you're fasting or not, you're reflecting on what Christ did for you and how he ultimately sustains you. And that's the exact kind of thing we need to be thinking about when we're fasting. And so overall, if you ever are fasting food or drink and you're in church, for instance, and they're offering communion, uh, ultimately you can take it. You can have peace of mind about that. And so hope this was helpful for anyone who's maybe ever wrestled with that. Hope this kind of gives you some peace of mind about it if you're ever in that situation. And until next time, God bless.